What if you could understand the future of global politics just by looking at a single day? Well, that's what we're going to do. We're zooming in on January 21st, 2026, a day where the fault lines of a new world order, both at home and abroad, were suddenly on full display. Let's break it down.
Right out of the gate, one theme just jumps out: global tension. And this isn't just simmering in the background. It's being shouted from the rooftops by the world's most powerful leaders, starting with a really sharp statement from a key European figure.
Yeah, this quote from French President Emmanuel Macron, this wasn't just some polite diplomatic disagreement. This was a direct shot at President Trump. It came right after Trump threatened to hit Europe with new tariffs unless Denmark agreed to sell Greenland to the US. You can just feel the tension in those few words, can't you? And, France wasn't the only one feeling the heat. This pressure was being applied to some of America's oldest, most reliable allies, and it was pushing them to ask some really tough questions about the entire foundation of their relationship with the United States. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she took it even further. She called for permanent independence from the U.S. And get this, she compared the whole situation to the 1971 Nixon shock. Now, for those who don't know, that was when the U.S. suddenly blew up the global economic system. So by her bringing that up, she's basically saying, folks, this isn't just a political spat. This is a fundamental break.
And then you have Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who put it even more bluntly: a rupture, not a transition. I mean, wow. When your closest allies and neighbors are using words like rupture, you know the very foundations of the international order are shaking.
And look, this wasn't just talk. These weren't just angry words being thrown around. All of this diplomatic friction was having a real, tangible impact on military cooperation, especially inside of NATO. The numbers really tell the story here.
So what are we talking about? We're talking about this number, 200. That's how many U.S. military personnel the Pentagon was planning to cut from NATO advisory groups. Now, it might not sound like a huge number, but this represents a major cut in American expertise in supercritical areas like energy security and naval warfare. It was a move that could weaken the alliance from the inside out.
Okay, so all of this is happening on the world stage. But what's fascinating is that a very similar theme of pressure and friction was playing out right here at home, with the federal government squaring off against state and local officials.
On that same day, January 21st, federal prosecutors subpoenaed these 5 top Democratic officials in Minnesota. They were demanding all sorts of documents about their immigration policies. This was a huge move, a direct challenge to the authority of state and local governments, and a major escalation in the fight over immigration.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just some abstract policy fight. It had very real, very scary consequences for people on the ground. Just look at the story of Chong-Lee Scott Thao, a U.S. citizen. Federal agents, in what they called a targeted operation, smashed down his door without a warrant, dragged him outside in his underwear in the freezing cold, and only then did they realize their mistake. He was a U.S. citizen, no criminal record at all.
As you can imagine, local law enforcement was absolutely furious. The sheriff of Hennepin County and local police chiefs, they came out and accused federal ICE agents of violating civil rights. They said flat out that people were being stopped, questioned, and harassed solely because of the color of their skin. They even reported that their own off-duty police officers of color were being targeted, a really troubling pattern.
And in the middle of all this tension, you get tragedy. And with it, 2 completely different stories that just can't be reconciled. The family of Geraldo Lunas Campos, a Cuban immigrant in a detention facility in El Paso, says he was choked to death by guards. Federal officials, on the other hand, maintain that he died by suicide. 2 starkly different narratives and 1 tragic outcome.
So you see this pattern of asserting federal power at home, right? Well, that was being mirrored almost perfectly by an equally assertive foreign policy. At the same time, old alliances were being strained. The administration was projecting American power in new and pretty aggressive ways in some key global hotspots.
So, where exactly was this happening? Well, on this one day, we saw huge moves in 2 key areas, the Middle East and the Caribbean. Okay, let's start with the Middle East, because it was just a whirlwind of activity. On one hand, you have Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu accepting an invitation to a new U.S.-led Board of Peace. But at the exact same time, President Trump was reportedly pushing for decisive military action against Iran, which of course put the U.S. totally at odds with its European allies. You could see that frustration over in Gaza, too, where those same allies were thinking about pulling out of a U.S.-led aid center.
And then in Syria, you could see the real-world consequences of these shifting alliances, as Kurdish forces pulled out of a key camp, blaming a lack of international support.
Meanwhile, over in the Caribbean, things were a lot more direct. We're talking about U.S. forces literally boarding and seizing an oil tanker, the seventh one, by the way, with ties to Venezuela. A really dramatic display of military and economic power.
And this show of force wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was tied directly to money. This number, $300 million, that's the first payment to Venezuela's new interim government under an oil deal with the U.S., a deal that, was only possible after the capture of Nicolas Maduro. It's a crystal clear example of military force, diplomacy, and economics all working together.
All right, so we've seen all these different events. What does it all mean? When you step back and look at all the pieces from this one single chaotic day, a pretty clear picture starts to form.
I mean, think about it. In just 24 hours, we saw the U.S. challenging its allies, confronting its adversaries, and deepening the divisions right here at home. From threats about buying Greenland to seizures on the high seas, it was just a day of relentless pressure, everywhere you looked.
Which brings us right back to that really powerful word the Canadian Prime Minister used. Are we just watching a transition? A temporary, maybe chaotic phase of aggressive politics? Or do the events of a day like January 21st, 2026 point to something much more permanent, a fundamental rupture in the world as we know it? And that's the question this single day leaves us with.